So for starters, please tell us about your beautiful name, Yardena.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to be here. So my name, Yardena, was given to me by my mother, who spent about a year living in Israel in her 20s and, working on a kibbutz and for Hadassah, and she came back to the States with all of these Israeli names she wanted to give to her children. She was inspired by Yardena Arazi, who was this famous Israeli pop star at the time that she was there. And I only started pronouncing it right once I moved to Israel, and my whole childhood I was known as Yardena, and I called myself Yardena, but now I say Yardena.
Well, it's lovely. So the first question I have is not one for every author, because not every author has a baby while writing a book. So tell us how that worked out, what that was like.
So I actually had 2 babies while writing this book, and this book is my 3rd baby. I actually got married. So in the course of writing this book, I got married and became a mother and moved from Israel to the U.S. So, it was really easy.
Right. Because the babies aren't much work, right? So please tell us about the title of, well, no, not the title, but tell us, I am going to ask that question, but tell us a bit of what the book is about.
Yeah, so Ghosts of a Holy War is about the 1929 massacre of Jews in Hebron, in what was then British Mandate Palestine in 1929, and how that massacre really set the stage for the conflict as we know it, and explains everything we see today, from the causes of the massacre to the aftershocks, which continue to reverberate. So the book doesn't just tell the story of the massacre and its beginnings, but also takes us through the entire conflict through today, including the war in Gaza and yeah.
So how did a nice girl like you come to write a book about a 1929 massacre in Hebron?
Yeah, so I actually started writing this book in 2019 after I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, that had discovered a box of letters in their attic as they were moving to a new home, and that box was filled with hundreds of pages of letters written by their late uncle, who, this woman, her name was Susie Lazaroff. She was a 70-year-old Jewish grandmother. Her uncle was David Shainberg, who wrote these letters, and she had never met her uncle because he was one of the young men murdered in this massacre. And she had known about the massacre, but not much about it. She hadn't really known much about Hebron. And when she discovered those letters, she gave them to her daughter, who spent 10 years digitizing them and organizing them. And she realized she was sitting on a treasure trove of history, because so little has been written about both the massacre itself and also what Hebron was like before the massacre. And in his letters, David paints this vivid, beautiful portrait of what Hebron was before that beauty was shattered. Because before the massacre, Hebron was actually this beacon of coexistence in Palestine. It was the safest place to be a Jew in Palestine. Jews and Muslims had lived side by side in peace for centuries, not just in peace and not just the coexistence like we know today. They were friends, they were business partners, they didn't just live in the same town, they worked together, they owned businesses together. Many of the Jews who lived in Hebron even rented their homes from Arab landlords. And actually one of the most beautiful elements of, when I was researching this massacre, there weren't many, bright sides to it, but that was probably one of the only ones that I came across, which was stories of heroism by Muslims who saved their Jewish neighbors during the massacre. And when I was introduced to this family, I just knew there was such a bigger story to tell beyond this young man's incredible story, this young man, David Shainberg, who had moved to Palestine when he was 22 in 1928 to study Torah at the Hebron Yeshiva and lost his life to the massacre.
Well, thank you, because there's a lot in the book, and I think we don't want to lose sight of the importance of David, who was such a mensch. If you want to describe him a little more, but pictures of him in a suit and tie and charitable.
Yeah, so first I want to say that there is a Boston connection to this story because David, he was 22 when he sailed to Palestine, but in the year before he moved there, he spent his whole life in Memphis, but between Memphis and Hebron, he spent 1 year living in New York. And when he was living in New York, he became very close friends with another young, intellectual, spiritual young man named Henry Chill. And he ended up falling in love with his little sister, Sylvia Chill. And during his year in Hebron, before he was killed, he and David and Sylvia exchanged letters almost every week. And they had actually planned to marry, and she was planning to move to Hebron. And Sylvia's daughter is sitting right here, Karen Ronberg. Funny story, we were actually just out to dinner before, and we ended up sitting at the table next to each other. I had interviewed her for the book, but we had never met in person, so talk about beshert. But more about David. He was this very handsome, lovely young man who everyone who met him loved him. He was from Memphis, so he spoke with this southern twang that, until writing this book, I had never met Jews who spoke like that. So he must have been very charming to, the Jews in Palestine and also the Jews from Europe who were studying at the yeshiva with him. But he was this mensch, like you said, who before he was killed, he had started and funded this charity fund for less well-off yeshiva students who couldn't afford anything, who'd come from the shtetls of Europe to study in Hebron. And he did this anonymously. Nobody knew that he had started this fund or was paying for this fund until after he was killed. Then the heads of the yeshiva told the surviving students. But I really just fell in love with his writing. He was this beautiful, eloquent, he wrote so vividly that I was transported to Hebron through his writing, through his letters. And he really did that for his family. He said in one of his letters that he wished he could bottle up the spirituality he felt in Hebron and send it to his family in pills. I always wondered while I was writing this book, what could have been of David if he hadn't been killed by a hatred we are still living with, sadly, today.
Yeah. So how and when did you decide on the title of the book?
So actually, my working title in the beginning was Letters from Hebron, but my editor, who is very smart, said I should not use that title because not enough people know what Hebron is, what it means. And it was actually a combination of her idea and my idea that we came to Ghosts of a Holy War. I think her idea was Ghosts of Palestine, and I wanted it to be something with the words Holy War because I think so much of what we learn from looking at this conflict over the last century is that it has always been and continues to be a holy war, and that failing to see that has led so many people who are trying to solve this conflict to come up with solutions that don't work because it's ignoring kind of the bedrock of the problem. So that's how we came up with Ghosts of a Holy War.
So the apparent mastermind of the 1929 massacre, the Grand Mufti, has quite a resume. And I think we could and should spend a little time on him given his importance then and even now, even though he's not alive. So how about starting with an overview of his appointment and how that happened, which isn't all that pretty a story, and then meander through his rise to fame and power and wealth.
So the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, his name was Haj Amin al-Husseini. He came from this very wealthy landowning family in Palestine that was one of the most prominent families in the land. They had this historic rivalry between them and this other large family called the Nashashibis. And historically, before the British Mandate, it was usually a Husseini who filled the position of Mufti. They were often also the mayor of Jerusalem. So it was a very powerful family, but Husseini was not an obvious choice for the role of Grand Mufti. And he had already by the time he was appointed to the role by the British, who were ruling Palestine at the time, he had already fled Palestine. He fled to Transjordan because he was wanted for arrest for incitement of a previous riot in 1920, which he managed to be pardoned from by the British, because when they took over Palestine from the Ottomans, they wanted to ingratiate themselves with the majority Arab population, and they thought one way of doing that is by elevating this anti-British, anti-Zionist member of the Husseini family into the role. And what they did was they used this kind of loophole with the election process where there were 4 candidates. Husseini came in last. The Nashashibi candidate came in first, but because it wasn't like there wasn't a clear winner, the rules of the mandate policy, which followed the Ottoman policy, was that the High Commissioner of Palestine, who was actually Jewish and a Zionist, he got to choose from the 3 leading candidates. And Husseini was not one of them. But what the Husseini family did was post propaganda throughout Palestine, claiming that the Nashashibi candidate, if he won, he would hand over Al-Aqsa to the Jews. And so because of all the pressure he came under from the Arab population, he dropped out, and then the High Commissioner was able to pick Husseini as one of the 3 leading candidates because there were only 3 left. And he became the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which is the equivalent of being the chief rabbi of Palestine. So he was the most important religious leader, despite the fact that he had never finished his studies to become a sheikh, which is what you usually needed to have that kind of role. He also, after becoming the Grand Mufti, he was elected the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which was also created by the British and by Herbert Samuel, this Zionist first High Commissioner of Palestine. So it was considered his elevation, Samuel's elevation of Husseini to these 2 prominent roles was considered the biggest mistake of his career, because he had a very illustrious career and he was very beloved by the Jewish population of Palestine, and he was very decorated statesman in Britain before he was made High Commissioner, but his decision to appoint Husseini definitely backfired on him and the Jews of Palestine and the British.
So the Mufti, I'm calling him the Mufti, even though I think you call him the Mufti. I like Mufti. But he was, as we would say, actually it's my husband's expression, unencumbered by the facts. So he didn't hesitate to tell all kinds of lies that would help his position. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an understatement. So he was extremely unpopular at first. He was accused of corruption, nepotism, misappropriation of funds, because he, as the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, he was in charge of all of the Waqf holy sites. So, the Waqf, if you know, controls Al-Aqsa. They also, at the time, controlled the Western Wall. He controlled all of the Islamic holy sites in Palestine and all of the Sharia courts. He had so much power, and he abused it. And so he was criticized in the press. He was criticized by his political rivals. So what did he do? He decided to take advantage of the world's oldest and most successful scapegoat, the Jews. He began, and this rumor, as many of you probably know, is still alive today, but it began with the Mufti, and it began in 1928. He started to claim that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sits atop the Temple Mount. For Muslims, it's the 3rd holiest site in Islam. For Muslims in Palestine, or what's today Israel, it's the holiest site in the land. Temple Mount is the single holiest site for Jews, the site of the ancient Jewish temples. And he understood that most Muslims are aware that Jews pray for the rebuilding of the temple. And so he decided that actually the Jews of Palestine are planning to destroy Al-Aqsa to rebuild their temple. And he did that by claiming that the Jews praying at the Western Wall, when they brought a screen on Yom Kippur in 1928 to separate men and women when they were praying, he complained to the British officials, and other Arab officials did the same. They complained that the Jews were trying to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue, and that from there they would then destroy Al-Aqsa and then from there take over the whole country. Mind you, at the time, Jews were a small minority in Palestine. They were less than 20% of the population. There were fewer than 1 million people living in Palestine then. Today there are 10 million. And he did this not just through this disinformation campaign about Al-Aqsa, but also he created this campaign of propaganda against Jewish immigration, which was rising as a result of pogroms in Eastern Europe. We're talking about the decades after the Kishinev pogrom and all these other pogroms that led tens of thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe. And it was really interesting for me to see how similar his rhetoric was to so many anti-immigrant politicians we see today in our own country. He talked about these immigrants from Europe bringing values that are incompatible with the people of the land, because the people of the land were very patriarchal, very traditional. Women, one of David's letters, he describes his shock when he came to Hebron and saw all of these people walking around who looked like ghosts, because they were women dressed in what he thought were sheets, but they were, wearing burqas. And, many of the Jews coming from Europe were egalitarian. The women were working the land on the kibbutzim. They were, they had equal, as equal as you could be in 1929, but they were much more equal than they were in, Arab society and in Sephardic Jewish society in Palestine. So there was also this interesting, it wasn't in David's letters, but in my research about Hebron at the time, I was really struck by how before the massacre, and I think we'll get to this because it really transformed this kind of dynamic between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. The Sephardim and the traditional Jews of Palestine really rejected Zionism, not because they rejected this idea of returning to the ancient Jewish homeland, but because Zionism was this movement of secular, irreligious Jews. And the Jews of Palestine, the traditional Jews of Palestine, the Sephardim, people like David hated Zionism. That was something that surprised me most in reading his letters. He called Zionism this vile anti-Jewish movement. So the massacre just really transformed Palestine, Zionism, and that's why in my book I can illuminate how this massacre just really created so many of the driving forces of the conflict that we see today.
And he, I'm going out of order because I want to talk to you about...
Oh, wait, sorry, I didn't talk about
no.
the way he was unencumbered. We'll get to more of that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But yeah, he, but that's how he started the massacre, really, was by telling things that weren't true and riling everyone up.
That's how his propaganda campaign started, but it really accelerated towards the end, and it was also fueled by lies. So about a week before the massacre, there was Jews in Palestine marked Tisha B'Av by doing what they did every year, which was going to pray at the Western Wall, at the Kotel. And in August of 1929, 10,000 people, including David Schoenberg, went to pray at the Kotel for Tisha B'Av. And the next day, hundreds of them marched to the Wailing Wall again, protesting against the British for failing to protect Jewish worshippers at the wall, because at that time, this propaganda campaign that the Mufti had started had led to this just a nonstop attacks by Muslims against Jews at the wall. He also had this door built into the wall that allowed people, Muslim worshippers, to go from the Wailing Wall to Al-Aqsa, which made no sense at all unless you wanted those Muslims to attack Jews, because the Western Wall is not a Muslim holy site. Muslims who lived nearby would often walk their donkeys and just walk through the Wailing Wall, and their donkeys would relieve themselves beside Jewish worshipers. Like, they would do that on purpose. They would throw garbage there. They would smoke cigarettes there in front of Jewish worshipers' faces. Like, they were specifically trying to antagonize them. And the British, throughout this time, the British just ignored the Jewish community's complaints about the attacks, about the building projects that the Mufti was initiating. And there had been so many warnings, and finally this march occurred simply to protest against the British failure to protect them and calling for Jews to be able to own the wall, because the Mufti technically owned the wall under the Supreme Muslim Council. And the march was provocative, but it was peaceful. Yet the next day, Arabic newspapers and statements put out by the Arab leadership said that it was not peaceful. In fact, they claimed that Jews had raped Muslim women, that they cursed the Prophet. None of that had happened. And it didn't matter. I mean, that, we think about disinformation and misinformation as a problem, as a new problem, a modern problem, and yet, 100 years ago, they were dealing with the same problem. And 1 week later, when the riots erupted at Al-Aqsa, it was because these clerics were repeating the lies of the Mufti, saying, go defend Al-Aqsa from the Jews. And they did. And when the riots began in Jerusalem. But what happened in Hebron was that after Muslims began attacking Jews in Jerusalem, rumors spread, more disinformation spread to other parts of Jerusalem and villages and towns outside of Jerusalem. In Hebron, there was this driver on a motorcycle who came to Hebron and said, Jews are massacring Arabs in Jerusalem. Come avenge their blood. And so the rioters in Hebron weren't just acting on disinformation about Al-Aqsa and being told that they're defending Islam. They were also being told that Jews were slaughtering Arabs in Jerusalem, which they weren't.
Right. So we touched on the peaceful coexistence between the Arabs and the Jews in Hebron, and I don't want to make sure we mention that during the massacre, some of the Arabs worked to save Jewish lives, right?
Yeah, so 3,000 Muslim men participated in the riots. At the time, Hebron was home to 20,000 Arabs and about 800 Jews. Today, for comparison, 800 Jews still live in Hebron now, and 250,000 Arabs live there. But then 3,000 people out of a population of 20,000 was a pretty shocking ratio. But like I said, there were bright spots. About 24 Arab families risked their own lives to save their Jewish neighbors. One man literally arrived on his white horse from working in his vineyards and was told by his son. His son came running to the vineyard to tell his father that the Jews who lived in the house he rented to them were huddling in fear in their home because there were mobs of Arabs killing Jews. And this man, who was over 70, he arrived on his white horse and stood outside the door and said, "You'll have to cross through me if you want to get into this house. This family is my family." Inside was a rabbi who happened to be a descendant of Chabad royalty. The last name is Slonim. This rabbi and his whole family, part of his family, were rescued by this man who was actually stabbed in the process of saving them, but he saved their lives and he survived. But this Rabbi Slonim's son, Rabbi Slonim was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron. His son, Eliezer, was another very prominent member of the Jewish community. He was the head of the bank in Hebron, and he had many Arab friends. He did business with them. He was the only Jewish member of the city council. And so the morning of the riot, the morning of the massacre, more than 70 Jews had taken shelter in his home because his home was considered the safest place, because everybody was sure no one would hurt him because he had the most friendships with the Arabs, and Arab friends had even come to his house that morning promising to protect them. But when the mob arrived at his house, one of his friends actually said that if he handed over the foreigners who were hiding in his home, his family will be saved. And he said, "There are no foreigners. We're all, Jews are one people." The guy who offered him that was referring to the European Jews, who most of them were yeshiva students or family members of yeshiva students. And Eliezer was one of the first people to die, along with his wife and his 5-year-old son. Their 11-month-old was found barely breathing in his mother's arms that morning, and he lived.
Yes, there's a lot of detail in the book about how brutal it was that comes back on October 7th. And how did the Arabs generally view the Hebron massacre at the time? And has that changed?
No, it's really haunting how similar it is to October 7th, because the atrocities committed in Hebron were immediately denied by the Arab leadership, despite mountains of evidence. I mean, the testimonies from survivors, reporters who went there and spoke to survivors in their hospital beds or went to Hebron in the days after. The Arab leadership put out statements. One of them I remember so vividly because it's literally called Scandals of Jewish Propaganda in all capital letters, and it simultaneously denies that atrocities were committed in Hebron and at the same time blames Jews for causing the riots. There was another report in an Arabic newspaper that quoted the the U.S. Consulate, like the head of the U.S. consulate, saying that in Jerusalem, they quoted him claiming that Hebron yeshiva students carried out the massacre to raise funding from America. That they killed Jews to get funding from America. And, the next day, this American says, I never, he told all these other reporters, I never said that. The perpetrators of the massacre, many of them were arrested, but they were then released. The British arrested, I think it was thousands, but they put on trial 700 people. But in the end, all of the sentences they handed down were either lightened to the point of, comedy, like the guy who, the cleric in Hebron who led the mob, according to everyone, I mean, even the British head of police in Hebron testified before the British commission, the Shaw Commission that came to Palestine after the riots to investigate them. He claimed this man was telling people, go into this home, there are wealthy Jews here, go into this home, there are beautiful Jewish women. And he ended up serving not even 3 months in prison and went on to continue to be a religious official. Yet 3 men were tried and they were hung by the British in Akko prison, and they were celebrated as heroes by the Arab population of Palestine then, and they're still celebrated as heroes today. The Palestinian Martyrs' Day is actually celebrated or honored the day of their execution. And there were poems and songs written about them that are still considered very popular national anthems in Palestinian society. There's one that's called Red Tuesday, and Abbas and other Palestinian officials have often, praised these men who carried out the massacre.
Charming. So you started writing the book long before October 7th. You were on your way to finishing up, and then October 7th happened. So how did that impact your book?
Yeah, well, I could barely write for the first 2 months. I tried to continue writing the book. I was, like you said, almost done. I think I had a few months left before my deadline, and it was just impossible to write this book without changing it. I mean, because it had to include October 7th. The parallels between 1929 and October 7th were just so haunting and so dangerous to ignore that became the new kind of overarching theme of the book, connecting these two massacres and illuminating the parallels. But before October 7th, my focus was really on Hebron and how Hebron had become, had gone from this, the cradle of the Jewish people, burial place of Abraham, source of, holiness to both Jews and Muslims, because Muslims also honor Abraham as an Arab patriarch, and that's why Hebron is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. And so it went from being this, haven of coexistence to what is today the antithesis of coexistence. If you've ever been to Hebron, it's, really a depressing place. When I was there once before reading David's letters. When I read David's letters, that was another reason I was so drawn to this story was because the Hebron I knew was nothing like the Hebron David knew. And so I wanted to go on this journey to discover how that had happened. Like, how had this gone from being a place where Jews and Muslims were friends and business partners to being a place where, when people talk about the occupation of the West Bank, I mean, Hebron is usually where they focus on because it's where you can see the consequence of a military occupation, the checkpoints, the soldiers at every corner. And, when I went to Hebron in 2011, it was really tragic to see how Palestinians live there, but I had no idea the story behind it. And I think a lot of people don't know the story behind it and what could have been. And so that was sort of my vision before October 7th, was painting that story of how that had happened, how Hebron had come to what it is today. And I still do that in this book, but through that same kind of narrative of connecting these two massacres, because I think that really is the answer to how we get out of this endless cycle of violence, because the lessons are there. The lessons are in this century of disinformation and misinformation and propaganda by corrupt Arab leaders.
You spend some time in the book writing about the British attempt to give land to each side, to the Arabs and to the Jews, which might be almost a two-state solution, but that didn't work then and doesn't seem to work now. Would you explain what happened there?
Yeah, so in 1936, after the massacre, after the commission that had come to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots, that commission pardoned the Mufti, said that he didn't cause the riots, allowed him to remain Grand Mufti, president of the Supreme Muslim Council. So his stature rose after the massacre. He became, the single most powerful Arab leader in Palestine, and it became his word against no one. So anyone who challenged him, anyone who tried to foster, any Arab leader who tried to foster cooperation with Jews or Zionists in Palestine was either intimidated into silence or killed. And so he began this kind of entrenchment of his way, and his way became the only way. And his way was, there is no future for Jews in this land. It's a purely Arab land. Before the British arrived under Ottoman rule, there had been this system where Jews were essentially second-class citizens. Muslims were the first-class citizens. I mean, in Hebron, it still existed during the British Mandate. I mean, Jews could not enter the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, where Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Leah are buried. They could only pray from outside of the tomb. So his idea was to maintain that dominance, and when his prominence rose, many of the people who had been arrested for the massacre, they were eventually released, and they became more militant. And in 1936, there was another revolt that was not just riots, it was this massive revolt against Zionism, against the British. And again, the Mufti wasn't punished for this. He was, engaged with for solutions. And so the British engaged with him and with the Jewish leaders of Palestine to try to find a solution. And the British actually came up with the first two-state solution to try to see, okay, maybe we can leave this place. They wanted out. And they thought, okay, we can just give self-governance to the Jews for their own state and the Arabs for their own state. And it wasn't that popular among Jews, but the Jewish leaders at the time were open to discussing it. The Mufti said absolutely not. This is Muslim land. It will never be divided. And once he said no, no other Arab leader could say yes. And that was just the first two-state solution he rejected, along with other Arab leaders. Of course, the better known two-state solution that he rejected was in 1947 from the UN, when the Jewish leaders, embraced it wholeheartedly. And once again, the Mufti and all the other Arab leaders who were member states of the UN rejected it and declared jihad.
So they kind of had a never agree strategy, how has October 7th and the subsequent anti-Israel protests and the condemnations and justifications and blaming of Israel affected your view of the conflict and hopes for the future?
Yeah. So I think
I wanted to ask an easy question there.
So I'm a really hopeful person. And before October 7th, like many Israelis and like many Jews, I think, I'm not the only one to say this, October 7th really, really shattered that hope. But I still do hold out hope, simply because, how can we live without hope? But on the other hand, it's also, I think, shown me that in many ways we're really stuck in where we were a century ago. I mean, the denials that followed October 7th. I mean, I never even imagined when I was researching this book, never once fathomed that anything remotely similar to what happened in 1929 could ever happen again. And it didn't just happen again, but on a scale much greater than 1929. I mean, in 1929, 133 Jews were killed. October 7th, it was, 10 times that. And, 1929, I mean, reshaped the region, reshaped Zionism. It had a tremendous impact on all of us, on our ancestors, on the Jewish people, the Palestinian people. So I cannot even imagine what the impact of October 7th would be. But I keep coming back to when I think about the state we're in right now, which feels like, this upside down world. It feels a lot like we're still in 1929 or in 1936 when we had to convince the world that we have a right to exist. And I'm reminded of the Peel Commission was the British commission that had come to Palestine in 1936. This was the commission that presented the first two-state solution, which the Mufti said no to. So I would like to read from that, because the testimony that was given by the Jewish leaders of Palestine at the time, one of them was Chaim Weizmann, who would go on to become the first president of Israel. At the time, he was the president of the World Zionist Organization. He testified before this commission many times, but in 1936, when he testified before them, he began his testimony with an urgent plea to allow more Jews to enter Palestine before it was too late. Because at the time, and I forgot to mention this, but another example of the British appeasement of terrorism at the time was responding to the massacre of 1929 by limiting Jewish immigration and land sales. And this limit on Jewish immigration persisted throughout the Holocaust. And there were thousands of Jewish refugees who arrived on the shores of Palestine during the Holocaust who were turned away by the British and either sent back to Europe to die, or they were sent to British internment camps in Cyprus and in Palestine. So that's the backdrop of his testimony. He says, in words that are chilling in retrospect, "There are now in Europe 6 million people pent up in places where they are not wanted and for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places into which they may not enter. The United States had for more than a decade closed its doors to Jews fleeing persecution in Europe. In Stalin's Russia, Judaism was effectively outlawed. The Jews needed a home, he said. That home, he told the commissioners, was in the Jewish homeland. The Muslims had vast kingdoms in Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Transjordan, and Syria, on top of at least a dozen other states where Muslims were a majority, represented by a Muslim head of state. Could the Jews not have one small sliver of land to call their own in this world? The underlying cause is that we exist, Weizmann argued. The only question you have to answer is, have we a right to exist? If you answer that question positively, everything else flows from it. After he testified, the revisionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, his rival, who had been banned by the British from entering Palestine after 1929 because he was the most outspoken critic of the British for their failure to protect the Jews of Palestine during the riots, He was interviewed by the Commission in London, and he said that the source of Jewish oppression was being everywhere a minority and nowhere a majority. The Arabs of Palestine will necessarily become a minority in a Jewish home in Palestine, in a Jewish state. What I do deny is that is a hardship. That is not a hardship on any race, any nation possessing so many national states now and so many more national states in the future. One fraction, one branch of that race, and not a big one, will have to live in someone else's state. So that was the way the Jewish leaders of Palestine reacted to the idea of a two-state solution. Weizmann being the one who was open to, partitioning the land, and Jabotinsky was arguing for one Jewish state. So when the Mufti was asked to participate in the commission in the beginning, he boycotted it and allowed no other Arab leader to participate in it. But by the time the commission was ready to leave Palestine, everybody was pressuring him. Even the kings of Transjordan and Saudi Arabia said, only the Jews are speaking to this commission. Like, how is that going to help Palestine and, the Arabs of Palestine? So he finally gave in. And when they spoke to him, they didn't bring up the idea of partition. They just asked him how he thought they should solve the conflict. And they asked him so they asked the Mufti, what should be done with the 400,000 Jews living in Palestine? He said, we must leave all this to the future. Asked if they could remain in Palestine, the Mufti replied simply, no. That was where we were a century ago.
There you have it.
Yeah.
So, Yardena, thank you for writing the book and for coming to talk to us. I read the book before it was an actual book, as you can see, with my stickies and everything. You don't have to do that when you read it. That's okay. But I think the book should be required reading for pretty much anyway, especially those pro-Hamas kids on the college campuses and anyone else you think might be interested. Thank you, Yardena.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions. Since we don't have a ton of time, I just ask that you keep your question brief, and if you can, also keep the question pertaining to the book would be helpful. Switch. All right, does anyone have any questions?
Hi, thank you very much. Was the 1929 massacre, was it widely reported here in America in the popular press? And if so, what was our reaction?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because that, I think, is one of the most important differences. As many similarities as there are between 1929 and today, that was one of the starkest differences. It was front page news for the whole week, in the New York Times, even local, the Baltimore Sun, the Chicago, everywhere. It was front page news for the whole week that it was raging, because the massacre in Hebron itself lasted a day and a half, but across Palestine in every Jewish community was ravaged. The Jews of Jerusalem were evacuated, Gaza. So that was covered. The difference was that in 1929, it was mostly presented truthfully. There were some cases where it was portrayed as clashes between Arabs and Jews, which was false. This was an attack on the Jews of Palestine. Even the Shaw Commission by the British determined that. Yet the press in the United States and in London, they portrayed the Arab denials and the victim blaming for what it was. It was presented as lies. It was very clear to anyone reading their reports what was true and what was not. And today, I can imagine that if the massacre of 1929 were to occur today, these Arab denials would just be portrayed as he said, she said. The Israelis claim that 133 people were killed and that it was all Arabs, but the Arabs claim that the Jews did it. It would just be, it would be left to the reader to decide what he or she wants to believe. And in 1929, journalists and the newspapers who employed them understood it was their job to decide what was true, not to decide. I mean, it was just clear what was true and what was false.
Is there a sense of what the reaction was from the people in this country?
So,
Going on
yeah.
campuses, but generally then, what was
Horror. I mean, the politicians in America protested to the British. There were, there was criticism from the American government to the British for their failure to protect not just the Jews of Palestine, but American citizens who were living there at the time, including the yeshiva students. Also, 2 days after the massacre in Hebron, 35,000 people marched through Manhattan protesting the riots and the British failure to protect the Jews of Palestine. It was a Jewish protest, but still 35,000. I mean, we have many more Jews living in New York today, and we didn't see 35,000 Jews march through Manhattan on October 9th. Instead, we saw, masses of people celebrating the massacre and, accusing Israelis of bringing it upon themselves.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Tom Cheatham. I'm just curious about who the leaders of the Yishuv were at that time. You mentioned Weitzman, you mentioned Jabotinsky. Was Ben-Gurion there at that time? No. So.
Not yet.
And what impact did this have on the shape of Zionism in Israel as a result? I mean, direct changes to the way the Yishuv thought about itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I had promised to come back to that, and I didn't, so I'm glad you asked about it. So the opposition to Zionism that I discussed earlier within the Yishuv, among especially the Sephardim, who in many cases, especially in Hebron, really saw themselves kind of torn between, their loyalty to the Ashkenazi community, which they didn't really mix well with because their ideals were very different, and the Arab community, who they spoke Arabic, they dressed in Hebron, especially the men and women. David, in one of his letters, he says upon his arrival in Hebron that he sometimes couldn't tell who was Jewish and who was Arab because the Sephardim dressed so similar and spoke so similarly. But that opposition that they had and that many of the Orthodox Jews in Palestine had to this secular Zionist movement really melted away after 1929 because they saw that the British weren't going to protect them. They really just stood aside and let it happen. And so they understood after that if they want to live in the Jewish homeland, they need their own army, they need their own state. And before the massacre, the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force, was almost entirely Ashkenazi. And after the massacre, you saw more Sephardim joining the Haganah, and the Haganah became a much more organized and centralized force because before 1929 it was very disorganized. They had actually visited Hebron before the massacre. A contingent of about a dozen Haganah members, including women, visited Hebron and offered to get them out of Hebron, offered to get the Jews out of Hebron, or to send in reinforcements, to give them guns. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron said, "Get out of here. We don't need your help. The Arabs here are friends. You being here will only antagonize them." But in Jerusalem, the Haganah actually did manage to defend the Jewish communities. There were still many casualties in Jerusalem, but not nearly as many. I mean, of all the Jewish communities that were attacked in 1929, Hebron was the worst. More casualties, more brutality. 67 people were killed that day out of a total of 133 across the country. So, it really completely remade the Zionist movement in Palestine. In the U.S. at the time, there was still a lot of skepticism of the Zionist movement because many American Jews felt like Zionism would threaten their own place in American society, and we only saw that really change after the Holocaust or later. It wasn't 1929 that caused that change here in America. It was more of the transformation in Palestine.
I'm Dan. Can you talk about some of the pressures on the Arab community, outside of the explanation that the Mufti, said inflammatory things toward the Jewish community, but can you talk about some of the dynamics that were going on demographically with Jewish migration to the region, and also how Arabs were responding to that at the time?
Yeah, that's a really important question because there were other drivers of the anger that he was able to capitalize on. And, that anger and that tension was there. It wasn't that it was just because of the disinformation. The cause of that anger against Jewish immigration was that in cases where Jews bought land from, and it was almost always that they were buying land from Arab landowners, and often these landowners didn't actually live on the land. They owned the land, but it was, peasant farmers who tilled the land and lived on the land. And when Jews would purchase that land, often for massively inflated prices, some of the land was ridden with malaria, and still they were paying these exorbitant prices because, these Arab landowners knew Jews would pay it because they needed a place to live. And what often happened was the Arabs who were living on that land could no longer live there. And so they lost the land that they were living on. Yet, you would think that these Arab landowners would help their countrymen and maybe give some of that money that they had been paid. It was massive amounts of money they were taking for this land that wasn't worth what they were charging for it, and they didn't compensate the people who were tilling their land. And in some cases, but not all, the Jews who purchased the land did compensate the Arabs who were evicted, but not all. And so that was probably like the biggest pressure point that was fueling some of this resentment. But also the resentment existed because of, this anti-immigrant, anti-other, they had very conservative traditional way of life, and suddenly a village, a kibbutz arises meters away, and suddenly there's there are women who are forced to dress in head-to-toe burqas are seeing these women walk around in t-shirts and shorts, and so these men didn't want their wives and daughters to see that. And so there was a lot of this kind of resentment against people who aren't like us coming into our land.
First of all, congratulations. I happened to open up the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and there was a very, very nice review of your book. So
thank you.
Congratulations for that.
It was a good day. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Given that this is a piece of history that most people, especially in this day and age, are just totally unaware of, since the book came out, has it sort of rekindled any additional discussions about linking, then to now, or, the things that you may have been contacted about relative to the history you've done to sort of, connect what went on then to what's going on now?
The book itself does that very clearly. I'm hoping that, it will make an impact and, help people see the truth and see that this conflict is so much more than what people think it is or would like it to be. It just came out 2 weeks ago, so hasn't really had a chance to make such an impact yet. But I loved what Patti said about it being required reading, especially for college students. And I don't know if you know of Shai Davidai. He's a Columbia professor who has really been very outspoken against the anti-Semitism and anti-factual kind of phenomenon that we're seeing on college campuses, in much part driven by professors who are indoctrinating kids on these lies. And he actually, early on, I think it was like the day the book was published or the day before, he said that it should be required reading for all college students. So I think if that happens anywhere, even in one college, I would be very happy.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, it's not really a question, but I don't know if you are aware of the program, an Israeli program, the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem.
Yes.
And in that, you were talking about the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, and the British. And if anyone wants to see what was going on, it's that period of time where within the Jewish group, they were having terrible problems with each other. So it was what you were talking about, just rang into my head that that program was it was very violent and interesting to watch.
Yeah, there's an episode actually of that. I watched that with my husband who's sitting back there, and I loved it. There's an episode actually, and if you remember, but they cover the massacre. I don't think they mention what happened in Hebron, but because this family lives in Jerusalem, they show what happened in Jerusalem, and it was horrific.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you very much, Yardena, for coming to our community, accepting our invitation through the Jewish Book Council, and to Patti for leading a fabulous interview. It was such an interesting conversation. And if you want to find out more about Yardena's research, please buy her book. Copper Dog Books is... Copper Dog Books is in the back of the room selling books. Yardena will sign your book, and if you have any questions, she will be back there. And I just want to also please invite you all to our next event, which is Sunday, October 27th. It's with Larry Ty. He was a Boston Globe journalist, and his new book is called The Jazzmen. It's going to be a fabulous event. We're going to have live jazz and brunch, so please join us on October 27th. But thanks again. It was so interesting.